This is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague, Sydney Derrick, our librarian. Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast. As you just heard from Elizabeth, I'm Sydney Derrick, librarian here at the Society. Today we have an exciting episode for you. We are working in collaboration with a legendary historical society and the oldest in America, the Massachusetts Historical Society. When we were discussing possible topics with the folks up north for a collaboration, one of the first that came to mind was the relationship between John Adams, one of their most famous sons, and Henry Laurens, one of ours. Both were instrumental in the founding of the nation, and their personal relationship reflects the temperament of the times. So we're going to discuss that relationship more with C. James Taylor, the former editor-in-chief of the Adams Papers, a project of the Massachusetts Historical Society to publish the comprehensive collection of papers received from John and Abigail Adams and their family. And side note, he was also project director on the published Henry Laurens papers, which includes many items from the South Carolina Historical Society archives. So he's a bit of an expert in this area and is quite familiar with our organization. But before we get to the interview, let's hear some announcements. Come join us to celebrate the 250th anniversaries of both Carolina Day and Independence Day this summer. Our museum at 100 Meeting Street in Charleston will be open with free admission from Tuesday, June 23rd to Saturday, July 4th from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We'll have different speaking events, pop-up exhibitions, and family-friendly activities throughout the celebration, so head to the Programs and Events tab at our website, schistory.org, for all the details. C. James Taylor is a historian and former professor of history who was the editor-in-chief of the Adams Papers for 15 years. He has also co-edited several books on the correspondence of the Adams family, including My Dearest Friend, Letters of Abigail and John Adams, and A Traveled First Lady, Writings of Louisa Catherine Adams. Prior to his time in Massachusetts, he taught at the University of South Carolina and, as I mentioned earlier, was a co-editor of the published papers of Henry Laurens. Well, Jim, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for talking with us about John Adams and Henry Laurens. I think that while most people know of John Adams since he was our second president, and many South Carolinians might know of Henry Laurens, they might not realize that these two were contemporaries and they dealt with each other throughout the American Revolution. So before we dive a little more into John Adams's life, can you tell us just a little about the relationship between these two men when the American Revolution was beginning? Because it does change over the next few years, right?
Yeah, it does. It does quite dramatically. I would think that there was a better chance that Adams had heard of Laurens because Laurens was by this time an international figure. But they didn't meet until Laurens went to the Continental Congress in 1777. And Adams was really impressed by him. As a matter of fact, I have, and I'll read quickly, a portion of a letter that John sent to his wife Abigail upon meeting Henry Laurens. And he wrote, Mr. Laurens of South Carolina, this gentleman is a great acquisition of the first rank in his state, lieutenant governor of ample fortune, of great experience, having been 20 years in their assembly, a clear head and a firm temper, of extensive knowledge and much travel. He was impressed. And John Adams wasn't always impressed because sometimes He could be dismissive of people. He notoriously referred to one of his colleagues as well, I won't even say it. he, he, he had a way of being insulting and dismissive at the same time.
I gotcha. So that's notable then that he took a liking, it seems, to Henry Lawrence at first.
Right, right.
And in an article that you wrote for our South Carolina Historical magazine back in 2005, you mentioned that there is an engraving of a portrait of Henry Lawrence in John Adams's home. So did Adams hang it there?
Um, I couldn't say that for certain, but it's in a very prominent place. It's 1782 engraving of a Copley portrait of Adams that was done when they were both in England. And it was placed by, certainly by a family member, outside of John Adams' office bedroom, as a matter of fact, the room that he died in. And the Park Service people who maintained the home assured me, because it was something that I was really interested in, because I knew they had a falling out later, that this portrait, this engraving, would be placed in such a prominent position in the house. And they assured me that nothing in the house was brought in except by Adams' family members. And the earliest record of it is in 1965. But almost certainly it would have been John Adams who purchased it. Whether he was a person who placed it outside of his office, that I can't say for sure. But certainly it is in a very honorable position in the Adams house now.
That's fascinating. As I mentioned earlier, I think that many people know the name of John Adams because of his presidency. But what was his role in America before that? Was he a zealot for American independence, or was he more reserved like Henry Lawrence had been?
He was active. One of the things I think is a little different between the two men is that Adams was an author. He wrote things in support, or actually, I should say, in opposition to some of the British regulations. He wrote in opposition to the Stamp Act. He wrote some of the things anonymously, and they were influential enough even to be republished in some of the British press. So I think the thing that he is most remembered for in the early stages of the revolution, or pre-revolutionary period, is that he was the lawyer who defended the British soldiers from the Boston Massacre. And I think in some ways you can see I don't know what you call it. There are some parallels between Adams and Lawrence in this. They were men of integrity. They were men who were interested in individual liberties, and I think this is one of the things. They would do things that were not necessarily popular with the patriot crowd, and I think this is, from at least from my point of view, this is one of the things most admirable about most of them.
Well, and that adds, I think sometimes when we're thinking about the revolution or that time period, it's the British and the loyalists versus the patriots, and it's black and white. But there was a lot of nuance at that time in what people believed or how they chose to execute those beliefs, I think.
No, absolutely. Going back to the Stamp Act, in Charleston, South Carolina, there were radical patriots who were interested in ferreting out anybody who was associating or supporting the British. And because Henry Lawrence was a prominent merchant and you had to have stamps for a lot of commercial reasons as well. The patriots broke into his home searching for stamped paper. And as a result, I think this may have pushed him a little more conservative. He was more concerned after this with the rights of all South Carolinians, all Americans, whether they were patriots or loyalists.
Yeah, that's a great distinction, I think. We talked a little bit about how sort of that being reserved or that sort of quality, but it always strikes me as interesting that even the men of the time who were considered conservative or reserved, like Henry Lawrence, still got into heated arguments that sometimes even resulted in duels, as was true for Henry. So were duels or threats of duels something that Adams ever engaged in?
Not that I'm aware of. That's another distinction between them. I think John was more a man of words and speeches, and Lawrence was more a man of action. And probably this may have something to do with their training. Adams was a Harvard-educated man who went on to train in the law and became a very, if not the most prominent lawyer in Massachusetts. He dealt in words. Lawrence was a merchant, and he dealt in goods and movement. Also, another thing is that Lawrence was in the South Carolina militia and was active on the frontier. So he saw, when we say action, where Adams didn't. And also, both of them were, to think of a better word, prickly, and could take offense. The difference was Adams would handle it in words, Lawrence would handle it in pistols.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's something to note too, because here on the podcast, we've done some past episodes on some of Lawrence's writing, his pamphlets that he wrote against Edmund Jennings about the anonymous note. But what was Adams's writing like? Was it inflammatory or was it more measured?
I think it was more measured for the most. Of course, there's different. From my point of view, there's official writings of Adams, and then there's his personal letters. And because he was away from his family a lot, some of the most revealing writings were his letters to his wife, in which he revealed his ideas about individuals and his ideas about what was going on in Europe or in America. His writings, his official writings, and he was a political theorist, and his writings were influential.
Both men seem to have had an incredible work ethic. They took part in committees and congresses and treaties and diplomacy. Was this one of the areas where they found common ground, or was that just typical of the men in their circles at that time?
I don't think it was common for all. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to recall the person who said it. There was somebody in Congress who observed Lawrence activities when he was president of Congress for a while. He followed John Hancock, and then after him, John Jay held the position for a while. And the man who observed both of them noted how much more active and diligent Lawrence was than Jay. So it wasn't universal, but I think if you had to grade the members of Congress at that time or people who participated in the revolution as far as dedication, energy, and influence, I don't think you would find two more than Adams and Lawrence. They would be in the first rank.
Why do you think that was true of Adams in particular? Because we've talked less about him here on our podcast in general over the past few episodes, but what, I guess, spurred him on to work so tirelessly towards this goal of independence?
That's a difficult question. I think very, very early on in his career, he had to work hard. He started out slowly as a lawyer. He was not terribly successful. He had to build a business. And one of the ways, whether you're a merchant or a lawyer or whatever profession at the time, you had to invest in it. And I think also as time went by and he saw the changes that were taking place politically in the country. Also, being in Massachusetts, the British had a position in Boston, and they were very obvious. And I think the balance that he had between the Patriots and the British forced him to be as diligent as possible. For example, in defending the soldiers from the Boston Massacre, and in time, like I said before, he became, if not the most prominent, one of the most prominent lawyers in the colony and then state.
And I really like that parallel between, those actions that were maybe unpopular at the time. John Adams representing the British soldiers, and then Henry Lawrence attacked by the Patriots for his position regarding the Stamp Act. I mean, it's interesting that they both took stands that were unpopular, even though they're remembered as these great patriots and dedicated to the cause of patriotism.
Yeah, I think one of the things is both of them were interested in individual liberty, and that, for example, when Henry Lawrence was the head of the South Carolina was an independent state at one time before the Union was formed, and he was the chief executive, and they demanded, the legislature demanded a loyalty oath, and he signed it, but he opposed it and said that individual liberty, forcing people to sign it, went against his thinking.
Henry and John each had large families, although there were some differences in how their children were raised. For example, Henry educated his sons in England and Europe mostly, and John's sons were mostly educated here in the United States, in Massachusetts. Can you tell us why that may have been the case in each instance, and if there were any similarities in their families?
Because Henry was older, there isn't an exact parallel. Henry was a dozen years older, and his children consequently were older. One of the big differences, I think, is the fact that John had Abigail, and Abigail kind of kept him in line, if that's the right way to put it. When he became too emotional or became too angry, she was a settling force. She was his psychological support. On the other hand, Lawrence was a widower. His wife died in, I think it was 1770, and so he had some young children. That's why he took his children to Europe, his sons to Europe, and spent a few years there making sure they had a good education. I think one of the differences, and my friends in Massachusetts will like this, they had Harvard. And John Adams had graduated from Harvard, so it was natural that his three sons, would go to Harvard. I don't know that there was a correspondingly great institution of education in Charleston at that time. And consequently, because he had spent a lot of time in England and Europe, Lawrence was more familiar with the educational opportunities there. And I think that's why he probably took his sons there.
And you had mentioned something earlier about each of their eldest sons, that they had similarities between them in the way that their, I guess, lives or maybe even fame sort of unfolded. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
The better known of the two, of course, is John Quincy Adams. He was John and Abigail's eldest son. And he was, destined for greatness, and it played out for him. He traveled with his father to Europe. He was an amazing student. He spent some time studying abroad, but most of his formal education was in Massachusetts. And of course, he went on to greatness, Secretary of State, President, etc., etc. He was about 12 years younger than John Lawrence. John Lawrence was Henry's eldest son. He was in Europe. He was in England when the Revolution broke out. He is famous, I think, most famous, for trying to influence his father against slavery. He one of the things he wanted to do, and he encouraged his father, although his father was, given the temper of the times, more realistic about slavery in America, he wanted his father to help influence the development of a slave regiment where the soldiers, the black soldiers, would receive freedom upon the completion of the war as successful service. John Laurens was aide de camp to Washington. As a matter of fact, he wrote some of Washington's correspondence for him. He was a great friend of Alexander Hamilton, and I think he was on the trajectory to be a real player in early America. Unfortunately, he died in battle in 1782. Mm-hmm. And I always have this sort of parallel lives. If John would have made it through the Revolution, he would have been, I'm sure, a great influence in early America. Mm-hmm. Also, as an aside, when Henry received word of John's death when he was in Europe, he got the letter from John Adams.
Well, speaking of John Laurens and Henry Laurens's stance on slavery, you mentioned that a little bit there. And am I correct in saying that John Adams was opposed to slavery? And did this affect the relationship between Laurens and Adams at all? Because, I mean, as we kind of talked about before, although Henry Laurens might have felt some trepidation about slavery, he wasn't as vocal with his stance against it as his son was.
I know that Abigail expressed her distaste for Southern slave owners a few times. I don't remember, and it may have just slipped by me, of John Adams making particular comments about slavery. Henry's a difficult person to get a hold of because while he was at one time earlier in his career a great slave trader, I mean, part of his fortune was based on the slave trade. He imported thousands of slaves into South Carolina. As time went by, and sometimes I think maybe this is a result of him being as cosmopolitan as he was. He traveled in Europe a lot. He had been in the North. John Adams had never been in the South. So it was, as I say, I think Adams was not as cosmopolitan as Laurens. And I think Laurens witnessed society without well, of course, there were slaves in the North as well, but certainly not as dominant in the economy as they were in the South. And I think as time went by, part of it was, to a certain extent, he was humane and didn't like the treatment of slaves. Another story, as an aside, Richard Oswald, who was one of the peace commissioners, was an old business associate in the slave trade with Henry Laurens. And they carried on a long correspondence. As a matter of fact, Henry helped him obtain a plantation in Florida. And later, when after the Revolution and Oswald had to pull out of Florida, he wanted to sell off the slaves. And Henry Laurens tried to convince him to keep the families together, that if he just put them up for auction, it would break up families. So there was and this would have been much later in the 80s, 1780s. But it showed, I think, a certain sympathy that Laurens had developed over the years for the slave and slave families.
What was John Quincy Adams's stance on slavery? Do you know?
Well, of course, he is famous for the Amistad situation and helped get the slaves from the Amistad freed in a Supreme Court decision. He had a little bit of a difficult time, not necessarily with slavery, but with reputation, because his wife, who he married in England, was from a Maryland family, and some of her family held slaves. So and of course, John Quincy Adams lived in Washington, D.C. for a long period of his life, and there were slaves in that area too. So while he was absolutely opposed to slavery and fought it on different levels, it was tricky it was personally tricky for him.
Well, you mentioned that John Adams never visited the South. So, do we know anything about what John Adams's relationship to or thoughts about South Carolina were?
I don't know. South Carolina and Massachusetts are still pretty different places, but were extremely different at that time. I don't. I think that as far as John, and I say John and Abigail because so much of this comes out in their correspondence, had a general view not of South Carolina but of the South, and that I don't know that they could. I certainly could, point it out in a map and stuff like that. But as far as culture and the people, they were Southerners, and perhaps from Henry's point of view, they were they were Northerners, they were Yankees. So there's a lot of generalization there. I think one of the things is important to note is that we think of scooting around the country easily, either by car, train, airplane, whatever. This was not the case at that time. People did not travel as much, and they were not. As a matter of fact, when some of the people came to the Continental Congress, this is the first time. Washington was a well-known person, but until they met in Philadelphia, not many of them knew one another except by reputation.
Yeah, and I have to imagine that was an interesting time because, I mean, I think we think of America as this great melting pot now, and as you mentioned, travel is gotten much easier. But at the time, those differences between the North and the South, or even just between states, would have been really prominent, and they might. It might have almost been, especially, somebody from South Carolina and somebody from Massachusetts, it might have almost been like meeting someone from a foreign country today.
Well, absolutely it was, because in the early stages of the Revolution, there was no United States. There were individual states. You were a South Carolina man. You were a Massachusetts man. You were a New York man. You weren't an American until you didn't get the sense of being an American until later. Before that, you were a British person living in North America, and then you were, and like I say, in the early stages of the Revolution, each of the state was an independent entity, almost like its own country.
As I alluded to at the very beginning of all of this, the relationship between Henry Lawrence and John Adams did eventually sour. At least, from what I've read of Henry's side, I know that he had some bad feelings towards John Adams. So what caused that, and how did that play out? And how was John Adams feeling about that relationship by the end?
When Henry signed off the last time from Adams, it had to do with, once again, letters, and that some of the letters that had been sent to Adams to convey to Lawrence were held up for what Lawrence thought was an unreasonable time. This is a very touchy thing. And I think also there was behind this another issue, and that was Henry Lawrence, because he was captured on the high seas on his way to the Dutch Republic to seek a loan to support the revolution. And who replaced him? John Adams. And then when Henry got out of the Tower and the negotiations were still going on, he didn't express this openly, but I have a strong sense that he had hoped and believed that Adams should step aside and let him carry on. And I can understand that. Henry Lawrence was a businessman. He understood banking and trade much more than a lawyer from Massachusetts, and he was a more reasonable choice. So this kind of set him aside. And also another thing is Henry's health deteriorated somewhat while he was in the Tower. So he had been cranky before, and now he was even more cranky. So And of course, the death of his son shortly before this. And then I think other than the letters, the thing that really ticked him off in the end was that he had been involved in the peace negotiations in Paris, and he was involved in the preliminary treaty. But when they signed the final treaty in 1783, he didn't get word of it, and he blamed Adams for not including him in that momentous treaty.
What do you think, or do you have an idea of Adams's perspective on all that? Was he trying to be ruthless, or was he simply doing what he thought needed to be done?
I don't like to think of John being clueless, but he's a busy man. He has a lot to do in his own positions as a diplomat in England and France at that time, and I think he was just busy. I don't think he had any intention of not including Henry. It didn't happen. And likewise with the letters, I don't think he had any intention of withholding information or anything from Henry. It was an oversight at best. And I think that Henry, because of whether it be his health or his emotional state after his son's death, he was just angry. Mm-hmm. And Adams was a good target.
I mean, and I think, now this is complete conjecture on my part, but I would think having a artistic representation of someone in your home, whether you put it there or whether someone in your family did, that might indicate that at least from that side, there was no ill will towards that person.
No, I totally agree. And I'm sure that when Henry came back to America, and he lived into the early 90s, there were no pictures of John Adams hanging in his house.
It sounds like that's probably the case. Well, Jim, thank you so much. Is there anything that I missed that you wanted to touch on?
I don't think so. I think the important thing here is to recognize the difference in the men, their backgrounds, their education, their careers, but they both worked for the same purpose. And I think that was two amazing men, two great patriots, just totally different people.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. It was so great talking with you.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you.
And thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We'll see you back here next month when we sit down with our own archivists to talk about their favorite American Revolution resources that are housed within our vault. See you then.